This is part 2 of the story I wrote about Tabitha Turtle trying to deal with my own losses. Each night, Tabitha Turtle would try as best she could to curl up under what remained of her shell. Every morning, she would slowly stretch her legs and neck, and then the day's trek would begin. The scenery changed a little from time to time. Some places had more trees than others. She was grateful for that. The few times she had to walk across an open field, she'd been attacked by more of those bird-like creatures. Each time they returned, they took away with them little pieces of her shell, self-worth, and value. They were completely gone now. She longed for the day when she would see a friendly face. She dreaded and feared the lonely nights ahead with just her limited protection around her. One day, as Tabitha was stretching, she heard a familiar sound. It was so faint, but she knew it was real. She wobbled as fast as her little legs could carry her, all the way down to the stream, and there in front of her eyes was her grandmother. What a wonderful sight she was to behold! Tabitha made her way to her grandmother, stumbled and skidded down the rocks, but she didn't care. Finally, she wouldn't be alone anymore. When Tabitha was next to her grandmother reached her head over and nuzzled Tabitha's neck, causing Tabitha's heart to skip a beat. She was a little ashamed of her half-missing shell and tried to hide it from her grandmother. But her grandmother didn't seem to notice. She just welcomed her into her arms and gave her a big embrace. After gathering food and water, Tabitha and her grandmother set out together. Never once did her grandmother mention why her family had left her, and Tabitha wasn't about to bring it up. She was just happy not to be alone. It wasn't long when some other animals joined them. Tabitha watched her grandmother, who seemed to enjoy the company of these visitors, so Tabitha figured she could trust them too. And as they walked along, Tabitha began talking to these masked animals and found out their names were Rocky and Rascal Raccoon. She'd been told that they'd been traveling with her grandmother for some time and that soon they would be joining others from their club. Tabitha grew excited at the thought of more company. She was sure she would be safe. She wouldn't even need what was left of her shell for protection now that she had her grandmother and her new friends. But as they walked all day, she heard lots of wonderful stories and adventures that the Raccoon brothers had been on. And when Tabitha got tired, she asked her grandmother if they could stop and rest. But she must not have heard, for instead of slowing down the pace, it quickened. Tabitha struggled to keep up. She did not want to end up all alone again. That would be too hard. So she trudged ahead. She would lose her footing and she would slip, almost falling into a stream a few times. Her grandmother would chide her for playing when there was work to do, so Tabitha would quickly climb back up to the path and follow after Rocky and Rascal Raccoon. When they headed into the trees, away from the water, Tabitha grew a little frightened, but despite her better judgment, she blindly followed her grandmother. After all, she was an old wise turtle. She would know what she was doing, right? Once, deep inside the forest, Tabitha for the first time laid eyes on the club members that she'd heard all about. Included in this club were other raccoons and a few possum, and then she laid eyes on Shady Skunk, who she remembered all too well. She wanted to run away, but it was too late. She didn't know her way back. She curled up inside what was left of her shell, and she laid there frozen until morning. Daylight finally came, streaming in through the branches of the trees, just barely reaching the ground on which Tabitha lay, now completely bare of her protection. She had been stripped of her last remaining pieces of shell. Every bit of her trust, her innocence, and her purity had been taken. She lay in the dirt without protection and waited helplessly for the animals to come back and finish her off. There was nothing to protect her now. As she plopped her head on the ground, she noticed something not too far from her. Slowly, she got to her feet and went to pick it up. She realized as she lifted it with her teeth that it was a piece of her shell. There was one piece of her shell that the intruders had left behind. This piece, Hope, was hers to keep, and she would protect it for the rest of her life. With Hope in her mouth, she set off to find the stream and a place to hide. Thankfully, she'd headed in the right direction, for not too long after she began her walk, she spotted the stream, and to her good fortune, next to it was a large boulder. She drank as much as she could and ate until her tummy was full, and then she crawled under the rock and she collapsed from sheer exhaustion. At least she'd be safe for now. She shoved a little piece of her shell deep underneath the rock for safekeeping. She would stay there until she wasn't sure. But she was not going to come out from under that rock until she was certain she'd be safe. Every day, Tabitha would poke her head out long enough to grab some food and water from the stream, and then she would retreat back inside her shelter underneath the rock. From time to time, she would hear visitors splashing around in the water or lying nearby in the grass. On those days, she remained hidden under her shelter, and she didn't dare venture out for her daily drink of water. Some days it would rain really hard and the water would flow right under the rock to where she was hiding, and on those days she didn't need to venture out of her home. She was grateful for the times that she could remain hidden, for every time she stuck her head out of the makeshift shelter, her heart pounded in fear, and she was certain that this would be her last day on earth. Each night, her tears streamed from her eyes, flowed out from her hiding place, and ran into the stream, where they were washed away as she lay hiding in her sorrow. Poor Tabitha. It wasn't long until Tabitha was completely covered, head to tail, in the dry, caked-on brown mud. She was no longer recognizable as the little green turtle she had once been, but she didn't care. She wasn't coming out from under this rock anyway. Years went by like this. All the while, Tabitha remained safely hidden underneath her rock, until one day, a pair of bears came bouncing down the hill and landed in the water with a splash. Tabitha, startled by the noise, withdrew even further into her dark domain. Little Bear was giggling and splashing around. The elder one, Sister Bear, joined her in the water, and a game of tag ensued. Tabitha remained hidden deep in her cave, but she could hear the sounds of joy coming from the two bears playing in the open world. Their laughter tugged at her heart, for never had she heard such wonderful sounds. She longed with every ounce of her being to be as free as those two bears. For over an hour, Tabitha listened as the two bears outside continued to frolic. They caught some fish for dinner, climbed out of the water, and continued their game of tag while drying off in the afternoon sun. Tabitha's heart sank as she heard their voices drift off into the forest. How she wished she could have joined them, but she had no protection. She would be way too vulnerable. What if they were as mean as the others in her life? Nope, she thought she must stay hidden, for it was her only chance of survival. Much to Tabitha's delight, though, she awoke the following morning to the sounds of joyful giggling from Little Bear and Sister Bear. They had returned to play in the stream and fields near her rock. Once again, the sounds of laughter, giggling, and teasing seemed to beckon to Tabitha to trust them, but she could not risk it. Instead of joining them, she remained where she was and listened, soaking up all that they said as they talked about the lion who had given them a purpose for their lives. Tabitha wondered in her heart, who was this lion, and could he help her too? But she didn't have the courage to poke her head out and ask. That night, as Little Bear and Sister Bear trotted off, Tabitha pulled out her treasured piece of shell, Hope. She looked at it longingly and decided that if Little Bear and Sister Bear returned the next day, she would take a risk and poke out her head to ask who this lion was. She'd listened to them for 2 days in a row, and they seemed so different from anyone that she had ever met. If she was to survive outside of her cave, she would have to risk it. So holding on to hope with her teeth, she drifted off to sleep in peace for the first time since she had been on her own. Thanks for listening to the story. There's 2 more parts to follow.